The Miller mansion was a place of cold stone and even colder hearts. To the world, it was a palace of wealth. To Sarah, it was a place where she spent 14 hours a day scrubbing floors in a plain black uniform. Sarah was the silent shadow, a maid who saw everything but said nothing. While the rich guests drank expensive champagne, Sarah moved through the halls like a ghost. No one ever looked her in the eye. To them, she was just part of the furniture. But Sarah had a secret. She wasn't just a maid. She was watching. She was waiting.
In the grand dining room, the air was thick with tension. Mrs. Miller, the cruel grandmother of the house, was pacing back and forth. Her eyes were sharp like a hawk. Today was the day her plan would finally work. She had invited Marcus, the city's most dangerous and powerful mafia boss, to lunch. Mrs. Miller didn't care about Marcus's crimes. She only cared about his billions. She wanted her daughter, Isabella, to marry him so the family could stay at the top of the social ladder.
"Make sure the table is perfect," Mrs. Miller barked at Sarah. "If one spoon is crooked, I'll make sure you never work in this city again." Sarah didn't flinch. She simply adjusted a silver fork. She knew the storm was coming, but she didn't know that in just 1 hour, her life and the lives of everyone in that room would change forever.
The heavy oak doors of the Miller mansion swung open with a bang. The chatter in the hallway died instantly. A man stepped inside, wearing a suit that cost more than the maid's salary for an entire decade. It was Marcus. He didn't walk like a guest. He walked like he owned the ground beneath him. Behind him, 2 tall men in dark glasses stood like statues. These were his shadows, men who didn't speak, but everyone knew they carried enough power to end a person's career with a single phone call.
Mrs. Miller rushed toward him, her face twisting into a fake, hungry smile. "Mr. Marcus, welcome to our home. We are so honored to have you." She gestured toward her daughter, Isabella, who was dressed in diamonds and silk. "You remember my daughter, don't you?" Marcus barely glanced at Isabella. His cold, dark eyes scanned the room. He wasn't looking at the expensive paintings or the gold-leafed ceilings. He was looking for something else.
Before the story takes a darker turn, I just want to say thank you to everyone supporting this channel. Your likes, your time, your presence here, it means everything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be the perfect moment, because what's coming next, you don't want to miss it.
In the corner of the room, Sarah stood perfectly still with her head bowed. She was holding a silver tray, waiting for the signal to serve. To anyone else, she was invisible. But as Marcus walked past her, his footsteps slowed down for just a split second. A tiny, almost invisible nod passed between them, so fast that even the hawk-eyed Mrs. Miller missed it. "The table is ready," Sarah said quietly, her voice calm and steady. Mrs. Miller's face turned red. She hated when the help spoke without being spoken to. "Quiet, girl," she hissed under her breath. "Go to the kitchen and prepare the vintage red wine, and don't you dare spill a single drop." Sarah turned and walked away, her face showing no emotion. But as she entered the kitchen, she felt Marcus's gaze on her back. The trap was set. The king was in the house, but the real play was about to begin. Inside the kitchen, Sarah carefully poured the deep red wine into a crystal decanter. Outside in the dining room, she could hear Mrs. Miller's loud, boastful voice. Mrs. Miller was busy telling Marcus how perfect her daughter was and how pure their family bloodline remained. Sarah stepped into the room to serve. As she leaned over to fill Marcus's glass, her sleeve shifted just an inch. For a brief second, a thin silver chain around her neck became visible. Hanging from it was a small, ancient coin, a symbol that only a few people in the world would recognize. Marcus's eyes locked onto the coin. He stopped talking mid-sentence. Mrs. Miller noticed the change in Marcus's face. She looked down and saw exactly what he was looking at. Her heart filled with a poisonous rage. In her mind, there was only one explanation. The maid was trying to seduce the Mafia Boss. She thought Sarah was showing off a token or a gift to brag about a secret affair.
You! What is that around your neck? Mrs. Miller screamed, her voice cracking. The room went silent. The guests froze. Sarah stood perfectly still, her face as calm as a lake. "It is just a family memory, ma'am," Sarah replied softly. A memory or a trap? Mrs. Miller stood up, her chair screeching against the marble floor. She looked at Marcus, then back at Sarah. She wanted to prove to Marcus that Sarah was nothing but trash. "You think you can play games in my house? You think you can distract a man like Mr. Marcus with your cheap charms?" Isabella, the daughter, smirked. She loved seeing Sarah humiliated. The grandmother grabbed a full glass of red wine from the table. Her hand was shaking with anger. "You are a thief and a liar," Mrs. Miller yelled. "You don't belong in this room. You don't even belong in this world." With a sudden, violent movement, Mrs. Miller threw the wine straight into Sarah's face. The room gasped as the dark red liquid splashed against Sarah's face and soaked into her white apron. It looked like a deep, bloody wound across her chest. The wine dripped from her chin, ruining the perfect uniform she had spent all morning pressing. Sarah didn't move. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She stood like a statue, her eyes closed for a moment as the cold liquid ran down her skin. "Look at you," Mrs. Miller sneered, looking around at her guests for approval. "A mess, just like your life. You are a stain on this household, and today I am wiping you away." Isabella laughed, pulling out her phone to take a picture of the humiliated maid. The guests whispered, their eyes filled with judgment. They saw a powerful woman putting a servant in her place. They didn't see a victim. They saw a lesson being taught. But the atmosphere in the room changed instantly when a chair scraped harshly against the floor. Marcus stood up. His face was no longer calm. It was like a mask of carved stone. The two bodyguards behind him moved forward, their hands resting near their jackets. The air became so heavy, it felt hard to breathe. "Is this how you treat people in your home, Mrs. Miller?" Marcus asked. His voice was low, but it carried a terrifying edge. Mrs. Miller blinked, her smile faltering. "Oh, Mr. Marcus, you don't understand. This girl is a thief. She's been trying to get close to you to steal from us. I was just showing her that she is nothing." Marcus stepped around the table. He didn't walk toward Mrs. Miller. He walked straight toward Sarah. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief. The entire room held its breath. Mrs. Miller's heart hammered against her ribs. She expected Marcus to tell the trash to leave. Instead, the most feared man in the city reached out and gently began to wipe the wine from the maid's face. "You made a mistake, Mrs. Miller," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Sarah's. "A very big mistake." The room was so quiet, you could hear the wine dripping onto the marble floor. Mrs. Miller stood frozen, her mouth hanging open. She watched in horror as Marcus, the man she wanted as a son-in-law, treated a lowly maid like royalty. "Mr. Marcus, what are you doing?" Isabella stammered, her face pale. "She's just a servant. She probably stained your expensive handkerchief." Marcus didn't answer the daughter. He finished wiping a drop of wine from Sarah's cheek
and then leaned in close to her ear. He whispered something so low that no one else could hear. Sarah's expression didn't change, but she gave a single, slow nod. Suddenly, Marcus turned toward his two bodyguards. He didn't speak a word. He just made a small, sharp gesture with his hand, a silent order.
Immediately, the two men moved. They didn't go for their guns. Instead, they walked to the massive dining room doors and locked them with a heavy thud. Then they moved to the windows and pulled the thick velvet curtains shut, blocking out the daylight. "What is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Miller shrieked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You are locking us in our own home? This is an outrage!"
Marcus finally looked at her. His eyes were like ice. "You talked a lot about purity and status today, Mrs. Miller. You think power comes from the name on your front door, but you have no idea who is actually standing in this room." He turned back to Sarah and held out his hand, palm up, in a gesture of total submission.
"The theater is over," Marcus said loudly, his voice echoing off the walls. "They have shown their true colors. Give the word, and I will end this family's legacy before the sun sets." Mrs. Miller collapsed back into her chair. She looked at the maid, then at Marcus, her brain struggling to understand. Why was the king of the underworld asking a maid for permission?
Sarah reached up and slowly unpinned the white, wine-stained maid's cap from her hair. She let it drop to the floor. Then, with a calm hand, she reached behind her neck and unclasped the silver chain with the ancient coin. She didn't look like a victim anymore. Her posture straightened, and her eyes, which had been dull and subservient all morning, suddenly flashed with a terrifying intelligence.
"You asked about the coin, Mrs. Miller?"
Sarah said. Her voice had changed. It was no longer the soft whisper of a servant. It was the steady, cold tone of someone used to giving orders to generals. "This is the seal of the Black Rose. It hasn't been seen in this city for 30 years because the person who wears it doesn't need to show off."
Mrs. Miller's face went gray. The Black Rose was a legend. The ghost organization that controlled the banks, the police, and even the mafia families from the shadows. Everyone thought the leader was a myth.
"I have lived in your house for 6 months," Sarah continued, walking slowly around the table. "I have cleaned your toilets. I have listened to you plot to steal from your partners. I have watched you treat your staff like animals. I wanted to see if the stories about the Miller family's cruelty were true before I decided whether to let your business live or die."
She stopped behind Mrs. Miller's chair and leaned down, whispering just like the grandmother had done to her earlier.
"Today, you didn't just throw wine at a maid. You threw wine at the woman who signs Marcus's paychecks." Marcus stepped back and bowed his head deeply. "The cars are outside, ma'am. The accounts are ready to be frozen. We only wait for your command." Isabella began to cry, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The gutter rat they had laughed at was actually the queen of the city's entire underworld. The silence in the room was broken only by Isabella's heavy sobbing. Her mother, Mrs. Miller, sat paralyzed, looking at Sarah as if she were a ghost. The power dynamic had completely flipped. Sarah, still wet with red wine, was now the most intimidating person in the mansion. "Isabella," Sarah said, her voice turning surprisingly soft, "you are young. You have spent your whole life watching your mother step on others to get ahead. You laughed when she threw that wine, but I saw the flicker of hesitation in your eyes." Sarah walked toward the trembling girl. "You have 2 paths today. You can stay in this sinking ship with a woman who values a name more than a human soul, or you can tell me the truth about the accident that happened to the maid who worked here before me." Mrs. Miller's eyes widened. "Don't say a word, Isabella. She's bluffing." But Isabella looked at Marcus, then at the locked doors,
and finally at Sarah's calm, commanding face. She realized that her mother's status was a lie. She made Robert, the driver, dump the last maid in the middle of the highway because she asked for her wages, Isabella whispered, her voice shaking. Sarah nodded slowly. Truth is the first step toward mercy. She turned to Marcus. Inform the authorities about the driver and the previous maid.
As for the Miller family assets, start the transfer. Since they don't know how to treat people, they no longer deserve the wealth that pays for their pride. Mrs. Miller grabbed Sarah's wine-stained sleeve, begging for a second chance, but Marcus's bodyguards quickly stepped in. The elite life they had spent years building was vanishing in seconds.
As the orders were given, Mrs. Miller's cell phone began to ring. Then Isabella's. Then the landline in the hallway. It was the sound of a kingdom collapsing. One by one, their credit cards were being declined, their business partners were pulling out, and their secret bank accounts were being drained by Sarah's organization. "You can't do this!" Mrs. Miller wailed, clutching her pearls. "This house has been in my family for generations!"
Sarah looked around at the gold-framed portraits of Mrs. Miller's ancestors. A house is just stone and wood. A home is built on respect. You turned this home into a prison for anyone you thought was beneath you. Now, the walls are closing in. The bodyguards began to lead the guests out of the room. These wealthy friends, who just minutes ago were laughing at Sarah's humiliation, now hurried away in shame. They didn't want to be anywhere near the Millers when the police arrived. No one looked back to help the grandmother.
Marcus stood by the door, his eyes fixed on Sarah. He waited for her next move. The power he held was terrifying, but it was nothing compared to the quiet, cold authority Sarah was using to dismantle the Miller legacy. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the nearly empty room. "Make sure the staff is paid triple their yearly salary from the Millers' remaining personal funds. They are the ones who actually kept this place running while she was busy being elite." Mrs. Miller fell to her knees on the wine-stained carpet. She looked at the red puddle, the same wine she had thrown with such pride, and realized it was the last expensive thing she would ever touch. The grand dining room, once a symbol of the Miller family's untouchable status, now felt like a tomb. Sarah walked toward the large windows and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains herself. Sunlight flooded the room, exposing the dust in the air and the stains on the floor. "The debt of this house isn't just about money, Mrs. Miller," Sarah said, looking down at the broken woman. "It's about the years of dignity you stole from the people who served you. Every insult, every withheld paycheck, and every act of cruelty has finally come due." Marcus stepped forward, handing Sarah a sleek black tablet. On the screen was a list of every property, car, and luxury item the Millers owned. With one swipe of her finger, Sarah transferred the deed of the mansion to a local nonprofit that helped displaced workers and families in need. "You have 1 hour to pack a single suitcase," Sarah ordered. "You will leave this house just as many of your employees did, with nothing but the clothes on your back."
Mrs. Miller looked at Isabella, hoping for a final spark of rebellion, but her daughter wouldn't meet her eyes. Isabella was busy talking to one of Marcus's associates, handing over a hidden ledger she had found in her mother's desk, proof of years of tax evasion and bribery. "I'm sorry, Mother," Isabella whispered, "but the lowly maid was right. We were never as powerful as you made us believe." As the clock on the mantel ticked toward the hour, Sarah turned her back on the Miller family. She walked toward the exit, her head held high, the red wine stain on her uniform now looking less like a mark of shame and more like a badge of victory. The sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the now empty dining room.
Sarah stood on the front porch of the mansion, no longer wearing the wine-stained apron. She had changed into a simple but elegant black dress. Marcus stood a few paces behind her, his head bowed in respect. Down the long driveway, Mrs. Miller walked slowly, carrying a single tattered suitcase. She didn't look back. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing what it felt like to be invisible to the world.
Isabella stayed behind for a moment, looking at Sarah with a mixture of fear and hope, before walking in a different direction to start a life of her own. "What are your orders, ma'am?" Marcus asked quietly. "The city knows the Millers have fallen. Every other family is trembling. They want to know who is next." Sarah looked out over the city lights. "I didn't come here to start a war, Marcus. I came to remind people that power is a gift, not a weapon."
We will continue to watch from the shadows. We will find those who use their wealth to hurt the weak, and we will take it away, piece by piece. She reached into her pocket and looked at the silver coin, the seal of the Black Rose. To the world, she was still just a face in the crowd. She might be a maid tomorrow, a shopkeeper next week, or a teacher next month. Her true power wasn't in her bank account. It was in her ability to see the truth that others ignored. As Sarah walked toward the black car waiting for her, she left behind a house that was no longer a cage. The Miller legacy was gone, replaced by a promise of justice. The lowly maid had finished her work, and a new chapter for the city had begun. The moral lesson of this story centers on the idea that true power is silent, and character is defined by how we treat those who can do nothing for us. Mrs. Miller's downfall was not caused by a lack of money, but by her own arrogance and the belief that a person's job title determines their worth. She treated the lowly maid like an object, never realizing that respect is the only currency that actually matters in the long run. The story teaches us that status is an illusion. Whether someone is wearing a maid's apron or a mafia boss's suit, their dignity remains the same. Sarah's choice to work from the shadows highlights that the most influential people often don't feel the need to shout or show off. They observe, they listen, and they act with justice. The ultimate takeaway for the audience is a powerful warning. Be careful who you step on while you are climbing, because you never know who is actually holding the ladder. Arrogance creates blind spots, and as Mrs. Miller learned, a single act of cruelty can dismantle a legacy built on pride. Kindness costs nothing, but as this story shows, a lack of it can cost you everything.